in Babylon and had them serve the king there. And so every time the king would see Daniel, he would see the conquering country that he had conquered. Okay. So what they did was for Daniel, they changed his name to Belshazzar. What's that? Who said that? Belshazzar. Cannot say his name for nothing. He never, for some reason, cannot. I've tried to, Belshazzar. Daniel's new name. Just like that. So they changed his name so it no longer had the identity because Daniel's name, the EL at the end of Daniel, anytime you see EL in a name like Israel, Daniel, those kind of Ishmael, and EL, that means God, okay? And Daniel means the Lord is my judge, okay? And so his name had some meaning to it, meaning that his trust in God, his acknowledgement of God being in charge of his life, and that God is the supreme, is the one and only true God. And so they took that away from him and gave him a different name. The other boys that was with him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were also called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those all had meanings also that were originally their names had a meaning that was pointing towards Yahweh, and now their names are pointed towards pagan gods. And so they were trying to eliminate his identity or who they are. But we did see though that Daniel is and his three friends were young men of character. So today we're going to talk about really the first major test that they are now in. I'm just going to go ahead and read verses 8 through 21. This is Daniel chapter 1. I'm just going to go ahead and read the whole section, and then we're going to come back and look at the two sections of it. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should we see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare your appearance with that of the younger men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance to what you see. So he agreed. This is testing them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. The four young men gave God knowledge and understanding of all, for the four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all other kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And into the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them. He found them 10 times better than the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until his first year of King Cyrus. So the first section we see here is the testing that Daniel and his three friends are going through. Now, remember, they stripped away Daniel's identity of who he is and tried to get him to worship pagan gods. That also includes him eating the same food that is being fed to the king. Now, what we do know is that if a king is worshiping a pagan god, chances are the food that you're eating were sacrificed to that god. Okay, so if Daniel is eating the food that the king was going to eat, that means that the meat more than likely was an animal that had been sacrificed to some pagan god. Daniel didn't want that. He wasn't going to defile his body by consuming something that was worshipped to a pagan god. So it says there in verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission to not to defile himself this way. So we see here that Daniel, still a young man, mind you. In my mind, okay, at 13 years old or 14, young teenager, if I had a chance to eat a porterhouse, I'm gonna do it. But Daniel had the as my grandfather used to say, the intestinal fortitude. Daniel had the guts to stand up for what was right. His parents did something in the education of who God is in their life and the importance of God, Yahweh, to them, that Daniel carried that even when his parents were around. He carried on that legacy. To Daniel, it was more important to him to disobey the king than it was to, it was better for him to disobey the king to Daniel's eyes than to disobey God. But I like here that Daniel could have easily just gone with the crowd. He could have easily just, had the mindset of everyone else is doing it. Or we had better obey the king. Or we'll obey on the outside, but on the inside we're going to keep our faith privately. You see, these 4 young men didn't do that. They didn't compromise. They dared to believe God's word and trust God for victory. They had surrendered their bodies and minds to the Lord. Let's stop right there. Now, the question I want to ask is this. What are we willing to give up in the sake of comfort? What areas are we willing to push the borders back so that we would feel comfortable? I'm not talking about buying a lazy boy. I'm talking about what lines in the sand, if we draw on and said, I am a follower of Christ, I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden, we find that line slowly moving and slowly moving. Now, I'm not throwing darts, okay? I want to be very clear about that. I'll give you an example. Brother J.B. Fuller, a little preacher about that tall. When I was a kid, I remember my parents talking about a sermon because the pastor at this time, and we're talking about in the early 80s, okay? At that time, I don't know when color TV came around here, but back then, the TVs were like a big cabinet, right? And everyone I knew had black and white television. I didn't know anybody color TV until like 84, 85. And I remember my parents coming home and the pastor talking about a sermon about the importance of getting rid of your television in the house. Because the filth that's coming in on your television in the 80s. Okay? Imagine what today is. Listen. And I remember my parents talking about drawing that line in the sand. And I remember my dad, because we had like a 15-inch black and white. And I remember seeing my dad carrying the TV out through the front living room, because it always sat at the kitchen table. I remember him carrying it through the living room, and he was saying he was going to throw it away. And I was just like, how am I going to watch Inspector Gadget? I just was freaking out, And the next day, this was on a Sunday or after church. On Monday, I went to school because I went to when I was in kindergarten. I went to the private school the church had. Well, after school, the pastor's wife babysit me for a couple hours before Mom could pick me up after she got off work at Burger King. Well, I wasn't allowed. None of the kids were allowed in the front room, the living room. That was like where the sofas were wrapped in plastic, and it was like only special people could go to the front room of the pastor's house. But I remember hearing noises coming from the living room, and so I looked over the little short wall, and there's the pastor's son, David Ford, watching television. Not only a television, but like a big, huge cabinet television that was colored TV. I could actually see the television from the little entry I was looking at. And I went home and I told my parents, and my dad hit the ceiling. Like my dad, I remember him yelling he's going to tell us in a sermon we should be watching TV, and little Davy's watching television. What I'm getting at is, what line we put in the sand, but we push it because of comfort, or we don't want to feel awkward around someone else. When do we listen to that and even laugh at that inappropriate joke that someone says? When do we become a part of something that we know that we shouldn't become a part of just because we don't want to feel awkward around our friends, or maybe that it's become so easy for us to push the line in the sand that we don't even know that we've pushed that line. That's what we see, the opposite of that here, Daniel. Could Daniel have still eaten the king's food and still been, a righteous man, a righteous young boy? Well, by today's standards of we can go back and look at the New Testament, I would say by the Old Testament standards, no. But by the New Testament standards, yeah, he could. But Daniel wanted to make sure that his life was righteous, that he was righteous, so he was unwilling to allow that to become part of his life. You see, these four young men had surrendered their bodies and minds to the Lord. Romans 12, chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 instructs us that they were willing to let God do the rest of their life, or do the rest in the story. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God." You see, Daniel didn't want to just present his body as a holy sacrifice spiritually to God, but also physically to God. It goes on to say in Romans, "This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to be tested and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." You see, in the New Testament, that hadn't been written yet, and Daniel didn't have that verse to back on. But this says here that we must not be conformed to the pattern of this world. Do you spiritually look like the world? Do I look like the world? You see, we many times push that line because we don't want to feel uncomfortable socially, or we don't want to be viewed as something different. But God's word says that we're to be different. We're to be weirdos. There was a book that was written called Jesus Freaks, written many years. I was like in the 90s. I've seen some smiles. Some people read it, and it's a book about martyrs, about people who stand up and say, "No, I'm a follower of God." And I remember my family burned that book because I brought it home. My family was so upset because I brought this book home and I read it. My family used it for kindling to start a fire in the fireplace because it said that we were putting the word Jesus and freaks in the same sentence. But we missed the meaning of it. We are to be different. We're to be viewed as freaks in the community. Why? Because we were not conformed. We're not to be conformed by the pattern of this world. We're not to look like the world. The pattern. Does everyone know what a pattern is? A pattern, if you talk to a seamstress, it's the pattern they put over top of the material to cut it out to the shape you need. If you talk to a woodworker, a woodworker makes a pattern that you lay the template on top of the wood you want to cut out, and you draw all around it, and then it gives you the guide to cut around. You see, we're not to follow the guide that this world has for us. When the world says do X, Y, and Z, we go, no, God's word says otherwise. See, Daniel refused to be part of that pattern, that guide of the world. Why should we not be conformed to this world? Because we're to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. It must start with the way we think. We change the way we think, it changes the way we act. You see, Daniel thought completely different than all the other people around him. Mishael and Hananiah and Azariah thought differently than everyone else around them. They said no, because of the transforming of their mind, the way they thought, it changed the way they act. So then they acted differently. They are to look differently. Why is it we only read of 4 young men in this passage when I'm sure there was far more people taken from Jerusalem, taken from the Jews, far more people taken away from the Jews and to serve as a Babylonian? But we only hear about 4. We don't hear other people standing up for the cause of wanting to live like and look like God. How many other people conformed to the Babylonians? Well, when we do stand up, it makes ourselves a target. When we refuse to be transformed by this world, when we refuse to be part of the pattern this world has set, when we refuse to be the guide of this world, it makes us an easy target. We stand out. And we don't like that, right? So Daniel, though, what does he do? He doesn't want to transform. He doesn't want to conform to the Babylonians. He asks them for a 10-day test, which, considered a 3-year-long time that he was educated as a student, 10 days is no biggie, okay? So he asked for a 10-day test, which he asked for just vegetables and water. He virtually asked to be a vegetarian. Because the vegetables weren't sacrificed to God, it was the animals that were sacrificed. And also there's a wine offering they would sacrifice. So he just had the things that come from the ground. See, Proverbs 16:7 says this: when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. You see, Daniel asked the servant to allow him to eat only vegetables and water. And immediately we see him go, oh, now hold on, Daniel, I don't want my boss man to get upset with me. But Daniel asked him, he says, verse 12, please test your servant for 10 days and give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare your appearance to that of the young men and the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance to what you see. Verse 14, so he agreed to this and tested it for 10 days. So the servant originally was like uneasy about it, but God softened his heart and made him at peace at the test. So the servant was afraid of changing the king's orders, because if something happens to Daniel and his buddies, he would be held accountable to it. So now, 10 days, Daniel and his buddies eat just vegetables and water. And we see here that it comes about, they're healthy. It actually says that they were healthier and more handsome than any other student who ate from the king's table. I find that interesting. Or in verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate at the royal food. So not only did they survive, not only did they not lose weight, but they looked better. So the guard took away their choice food and wine, and they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. You see, it takes faith and obedience to overcome the temptations and pleasures of the world. 1 Corinthians 10:13, once again, another New Testament passage, hadn't been written yet, but Daniel and his 3 friends knew the truths by their experience. It says in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. You see, God provided a way out for Daniel. Possibly he was tempted when eating, the porterhouse that was sacrificed to some god, some pagan god. But God provided a way out. By the way, that way out, okay, because I'm a meat eater. All right, I love me a steak. All right, that way out, may not be my choice way out. I would not want to eat. I'm going to tell you, I would not want to eat vegetables and water. Okay? I would struggle with that. See, the way out God gives us sometimes isn't our choice way out. We have to recognize, why are we doing this? Because of what we discussed in Romans. Because that we are to be transformed by the renewing of my mind. That I'm not to be the pattern of this world. I'm supposed to be different. See, God provided these boys a way out. And I love how the fact that Daniel was very polite to the Babylonian servants. He didn't parade his beliefs around and beat the guy over the head. How dare you try to feed me the king's food? I'm not supposed to be eating that kind of pagan stuff. No, he politely asked. He wasn't wasn't going to embarrass the man. He respected the position that that person was in. Bottom line is, verse 12 is a good example for us to follow, that we may hold to our own convictions without becoming jerks. Verse 12, he says, please test your servants for 10 days. He didn't give a big spiel about, it just says, please test your servants for 10 days and give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. He didn't say, verily I say unto thee, how dare thy feed us food offered to pagan idols, because we must consecrate ourselves. That's not what he did. He was very polite and very gentle. See, this, like I said, verse 12 is a good example that we must follow to hold to our conviction, but not be jerks about. We are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Romans chapter 10 verses 12, 1 and 2 says we're supposed to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. It doesn't say that we must be transformed by making everyone else feel less than. So now this test happens. Verse 17 through 21, and then goes on to talk about how these young men, what happened because of them standing up for God. This test of 10 days was nothing compared to a 3-year course at the University of Babylon. It's really kind of what they were a part of. So, what happened because these young men stood up for what was right? What happened when they said, no, we're not going to defile our bodies with something that sacrifices another god? Verse 17 says this, to these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time said the king to bring them into his service. The chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And every matter of wisdom and understanding about which of these kings questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. You see, the magicians and the enchanters, these were the people that would look to the stars to give the king advice about how to rule his kingdom. These were the main advisors to the king. The king found these boys 10 times more wise and full of knowledge than anyone else. You see, God not only protected Daniel and the boys, not only did he make them stronger, but he also gave them wisdom and knowledge. You see, Daniel didn't make the popular choice. And we're going to see this throughout the book of Daniel. But the one thing that jumped out at me is verse 21. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel was there for a long term. He stood the test of time. 1 John 2:17 says, he who does the will of God abides forever. You see, Daniel was there for a long term. He was there the longest. And we're going to see Daniel, how he, not only did Daniel prosper spiritually through this time, but we're going to see Daniel through the book written about him, how he survived 4 kings. That's unheard of. Okay? What's the first thing you're going to do when another king comes in? You're going to kill the advisors left over, because you don't want, their loyalty isn't to you anymore. Their loyalty is to the previous king. So you're either going to let him go or kill him. But Daniel survived 4 kings. That should show you the wisdom that Daniel had and the integrity that Daniel had. And it was acknowledged that he had this. Daniel truly was transformed by the renewing of his mind to follow God. See, we need Christians today who will have purpose in their hearts to put Christ first in everything. Just like Daniel did and the boys did. They put serving God first. So the question to ask this: what trials are we going through that we're allowing the line to be moved? What social issues are we going through? What tests are we going through, or have gone through that we allowed the line to move? Once again, I want to read to you Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to give you the backdrop of what our responsibility is as followers of Christ. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 says this: Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve that God's will is His good, pleasing, and perfect will. The last section of that is a question I've been asked a lot, and the pastor's even asked a lot sometimes. What's God's will in my life? It says right here. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. You want to know what God's will is for your life? We must first go back and transform the way we think. We transform the way we think, that transforms the way we act. The way we act gives us the opportunity to test and to determine God's will for our life. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for this example we see here, Daniel and the boys, where they changed the way that they were thinking. And the way that they were thinking changed the way they act. And they were not willing to push the line back, the line in the sand that they set. They wanted to serve you, Lord, to the point of eating just vegetables and water. And we see here, though, that they received rewards through that by being great men of wisdom. People recognize that. Lord, in my own life, I've wondered and I've asked, how often have I pushed that line back? We must be transformed by the renewing of our mind, which will change how we act. God, I pray that as we go through today and the rest of this week, that we use this time of evaluation. Not just by words, but what your word says. And who you are in our life and what we're called to do and to be. I pray as we learned here in Romans chapter 12 that we must not conform to this world, but be renewed by our minds. I ask you, God, in all these things, in your name we pray, Lord.